Welcome to Business Talk Sister Gawk. I'm Becca.
And I'm Ruthie.
And today we are starting a 3-part series on this topic of failure. Today we're specifically going to be digging into some data research and insecurities behind people starting businesses or why people don't start them. And I think data is super important to me personally. It's near and dear to my heart because if I know what statistically is practical, it allows me the confidence to move forward or just to completely change course in what I set about doing. So some of the information that we've been researching for this topic, I've also looked into a little bit already in the past. And so Ruthie's going to share a little bit of what she's been finding, and we're going to talk, and she's going to give us some ideas for how to understand researching statistics as well within that.
Yeah. So basically what I was finding was that there is, across the board, people vary a lot in the statistics that they're producing and that they're reporting. So what's really important when you're looking at those statistics and those studies that people have done on small businesses is to look at the sample size that they have. Because if somebody only polls like 20 people or 10 people or something, and then they say, oh, well, like 90% of people did not have successful businesses, but they maybe interviewed people that they know or whatever, or something like that, where the sample size is not necessarily indicative of the whole nation or the whole what that would mean for your industry. So it's really important to break it down by industry as well as having a large sample size when you look at those statistics. It's really hard to be able to pull those numbers accurately if there is a large bias in the question that the researcher is asking, if it's really opinions based. So keep that in mind when you're looking at different statistics. But one of the articles that I found that I thought was really interesting and had a lot of really sobering statistics, but at the same time also very hopeful. It's from fortunely.com. And the first line item that they had here was that only 78.5% of small businesses survived that first year. And then they go on to talk about how 21.5% of the small businesses don't make it past the first year, basically. So that 78% do make it past. And when you think about that, it is actually very encouraging, because when you think about the reasons that those small businesses didn't succeed, there's a lot of different reasons why small businesses might not succeed, but one thing is that they lose focus a lot of times and they're not investing in themselves or in the company. And so be encouraged that you listening to this podcast is showing that you care about your business, is that you're working on your business and trying to find ways to improve it, which statistically a lot of the small businesses that end are not doing that. They're not finding ways that they can become more financially efficient, or cut back on cost, or find ways that they can do things cheaply or free, and just really investing in themselves that way. And another thing that I think is really encouraging that was also from this article is that the small business failure rate has declined by 30% since 1977. So basically what we're seeing is this kind of trend towards, things are kind of crazy right now with COVID and all of that, and there's a lot of people who are really struggling, but just on the whole, we've seen so many more small businesses come out of difficult situations, or just in the long haul, we've seen a lot of businesses succeed. And I was listening to just a video that Dave Ramsey put out recently, and he was talking about how when refrigerators were invented, the ice industry freaked out, and so many people backed out of the ice industry, and they're like bringing ice, and having ice boxes and delivering ice to people. And so basically what this major ice producer did is he got into like picnic ice and things like that, and just talked about the statistics of what you can statistics of just staying on top of the ball and going through that and fighting through it and finding ways to pivot in your business, and what can we be doing to capitalize on this current situation.
Yeah, I think the word pivot is something that not a lot of people think about when I think about the word pivot, I think of basketball when you can only have like one foot on the ground or you're double dribbling. But anyways, besides the point, right? But like the aspect of you're going one way and then you completely shift gears to go another way. There's tons of stories out there of people who pivot their companies to do something completely different. I mean, just today I was looking through, and one of them was a case study about PayPal and how the guy started it to basically he wanted to start a Palm Pilot company, and he was like so into that, and people just kept sending him emails, could you make like an integration to make payment through eBay faster or easier? And he ignored it for like 6 months before he actually did something about it, and then just dropped the whole Palm Pilot thing in general, which good move on his part. We don't even, half of you probably don't even know what a Palm Pilot is.
I
Like,
don't know what a Palm Pilot is.
yeah, so exactly. But like thinking about that, like those things where you start a business, you think this is what you want to do with your life, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not. Okay, but there's a need here. I'm going to change what I'm doing to meet that need. And just because you started one way and you turned and you're going another way, yeah, you might have failed at like seeing that was a bad idea to begin with, but it doesn't mean that you can't make something out of it or use what you learned, right? Yeah, so some of the data with what Ruthie was talking about, knowing like the sample size and all of that, just so important when, if you're doing, there's a big difference between primary data and secondary data. Primary data is when you go out and collect it yourself. Or if you're reading a research report from someone that they went out and surveyed a whole bunch of people. If you've ever read one of those really complex like research reports from like doctors or something, they'll say, here was the amount of people we did this test on, and then they have like a hypothesis and they figure out all these different things about, and then here's what we're going to see if we can prove this true. Now, the whole aspect that Ruthie was talking about is, are your questions biased in what you're asking? That's super important. One time I got a survey in the mail that asked me if I would rather fire the janitor of the school or lower my property taxes. I was like, you made this so personal to me. Like, basically you're saying, do you want more property taxes or less property taxes? But you didn't want to ask me that. You made it so emotional that you said, would you like to fire the janitor? Like, it was a professional company that got hired to send out these surveys. And obviously everyone within our town is going to be like, oh, don't fire the janitor. Like, duh. and then they'll take that data and say, oh, well, 99% of the entire town says they want their taxes raised because they don't want to fire the janitor. Like, but they're not going to tell you that when they put that information out there, right? So that collection of data, but you created the survey or you went and polled people and asked them, that's primary data. Secondary data is when you reference other people. So the Fortunely article that Ruthie talked about pulls into one article a whole bunch of data about small business, but pulling it from other people that actually did primary data. So they just basically cited a whole bunch as secondary data to prove their point about small businesses. So thinking about that is very important when we're thinking about insecurities. And the reason for that is, I don't know how many times I have talked to somebody and about sales, and they're like, oh, I hate sales because it's really hard to talk to people and they turn me down, or I feel bad asking and all this stuff, especially within sales, because you're like, you know that you're trying to make money somehow, right? But when you look at some statistics of sales and people who actually do sales full time, like that's their primary job, it's like you have to take an average of 8 or 6, was it 5, Ruthie? I think it's 5. I'm spouting all these numbers. 5 points of contact before someone will even agree to like set up a meeting with you in certain industries, right? And with what Ruthie was talking about a little bit, digging into knowing what industry data is important is so valuable, because even in terms of like a restaurant, there's certain data on the restaurant industry that's completely unique to that industry, comparatively to a different industry like the tech industry. And one of the places, like even in general, when you look at which businesses fail the most, one of the areas was actually tech. And I think part of it is because it's really easy to start with tech if you're a tech person, right? You can build something super quickly and with a whole lot of cost if you're building it yourself, but there might already be like 4 or 5 other products that come to market at the exact same time, and that's why your business doesn't do so hot, or maybe you just didn't market it well to compete
Mhm.
with those businesses. So I could see why the rate is higher in that industry, because there's less barrier to entry to get up and started to begin with. um, so keeping those things in mind, know what the data is for the type of business that you want to start, because you might think, oh, well, so many businesses fail. Well, guess what? If you make it a year, hot dog, you've made it almost over 20% of the people who ever started, right? Like, that's a big celebration of itself. I remember a year after I started my business, I had a celebration because I was like, I've made it past the first 20. It's like running a marathon and
Mhm.
passing all those people. So, okay, we had a couple other things that we wanted to talk about within some data that we found from a website called Failery, which is actually a podcast. BT Dubs, they just started in April. They have like quite a few interviews, and their first episode was probably just as awkward as our first episode. So I'm really thankful for a lot of you that stuck with us, because let me tell you, like, starting a podcast has some really big insecurities in that, right? So
Mhm.
within that, they have this web page with an infographic about startup failure rates, and they're, just so full disclosure, they said that their sample size was 100 businesses over a 15-year time period. Okay, so when we're looking at their data of what they pulled together, the common characteristics of startups that failed, and this can be across the board for like pretty much anybody who has a startup, right? Not just industry specific. The first one was, no surprise, incompetence. So I think, Ruthie, do you want to like expand upon what you think that would look like in some aspects?
Yeah, basically, incompetence is exactly what it sounds. You just don't know what you're doing. You don't know the terms of the industry, like they said on the in the article, and they have little experience with team and personal problems. So one thing that I think is really valuable is just kind of, if you're working by yourself, know your strengths and your weaknesses. We talked about this in episodes before, like know what you're good at and know what you're bad at. It's okay to know what you're bad at, and ask people to help you or hire subcontractors for things that you're bad at. But also know, if you're working with a team of people, know how to work with those people. Know their strengths and weaknesses. Know how you can work well as a team, because it's so common to have interpersonal conflict like that. So right now, my little brother and his friends are making a lawn mowing business, and that has been just a huge learning curve for everyone. I think, like I can honestly say that I have never dealt with so many emotions in one day. It's, one moment you're freaking out, you just got paid $20. The next moment there's a conflict, then somebody's crying, and then it's just like, and these are little boys, so um, but it's been interesting to kind of seeing that on a small scale of how their interpersonal communication styles have kind of come to a head in a lot of ways. And a piece of that is just not, I mean, they're young, they don't know that if you don't work you don't get paid, or if you're gone for a weekend and two of your other friends take a job, you don't get paid for that. Like, it's not a salary position, you actually have to work to get paid. So that is, just little hiccups that you work through when you're starting out things. And I think that can be more on a larger scale too, when you're expanding, or when you're especially when you're expanding. I think, like, when you have that initial success and you're like, yeah, let's keep doing this, and then you think, oh, I can just keep doing the same thing over and over again that we've done really well. And then you have to kind of think, okay, well, what are ways that we can expand our business? And if you're not willing to do that, that can cause issues. But that's where that competence comes in. It's just, okay, this worked, but now let's find other ways that work, or what works with our organization specifically. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to tell you, this will probably like be both our Gawk as well as our episode at the same time, because we were just about to do our recording when they were having like basically their little like payday of what we invest in the business and what we get paid, whatever. And Ruthie's trying to walk them through it, and I wanted to press record so badly to play it part of this episode, but I wasn't the host of the meeting, so I couldn't. But oh my goodness, it was literally like he was just getting upset about, well, I'm so mad. We worked for 2 whole days on this project and we only got paid this much. And Ruthie's like, that's because when people say, how much do you charge? You say anywhere from $5 to $40. If you say $5, people are just going to pay you $5.
Yeah, he's been having to work through like because he was trying to figure out how in 2 days they made like I think it was $90. They worked 2 or 3 days and made $90. And then yesterday they worked for 1 day, did 2 yards, and got paid $80. And he was like, "How did that happen?" It's like, well, because the other people were paying you $10. The other 2 yards you were paying $40 a yard. So I'm just saying, like, here we go. Know what you're worth. There you go. Incompetent. Know what you're worth. Know what you should be charging, and what that should look like for your business. And the other thing too that he's learning is just how long those things will take him and stuff. Learning curve for everything. Mm-hmm.
I also think within that, another thing that's important to understand is the emotional aspect of pricing. If you ask like your family members, do you think this is worth this much? First of all, your family can either be really nice to you and lie to your face, or they can be like really mean to you and say, there's no way I would pay someone to do that. Well, and I know I don't necessarily mean actual mean, but like maybe it's because they also have the same giftings as you do, and there's no way they would pay you to mow their lawn because they can mow it themselves, whereas like other people, that's not something they really enjoy and they'd be willing to pay for it. So the data of knowing who to ask and poll about your product and see who would be interested in paying for something or what it would be. Ruthie even did like a poll a long time ago when she was thinking about starting a different kind of business. She put a poll together on Facebook and was like, I were to start a business like this, what would you be willing to pay for and how much would you be willing to pay for it? And then she put like different categories of what kind of services would be involved. And then people just weighed in on, well, I would definitely be interested in this. Or she left like an open space for people to like add comments of things they would be willing to pay for if it wasn't even on her services list.
Yeah. And that was really valuable for me to learn, okay, here's something that people might not be willing to pay for, but here's a lot of things that I hadn't even thought of that they are willing to pay for. So that market research on your own part is really helpful. Yeah. So what we're going to do, we're going to get a little bit personal with the Sister Gawk portion of this. And it's silly, it's frustrating, but it's it's process, So I think like we're going to talk a little bit about what it has been like to start this podcast, and all the insecurities that have gone into that, and all the having to push through that and learn about ourselves and learn about what works for us and what kind of business model we want to have and the meetings we need to have and things like that. So I'm just going to start and basically lay out, well, yeah, my thoughts on that. For me, when we started out, I was not as gung-ho as Becca, which is pretty consistent with a lot of things. Like Becca gets really excited about things and it takes me a lot longer to process them, I think. Yeah, and basically the first couple episodes, I just had this overwhelming insecurity the whole time of like, why would anybody want to listen to me? Like, this is, I don't know. And that played a lot into my insecurities in my own business and starting out in financial coaching and having to really develop myself and my skills and how I approach what I do. And that also played into our podcast and it just even making, I remember the first time I made a Facebook video and I posted on my personal Facebook, just promoting what I was doing as a business as well as what we were doing with this podcast. And I recorded it like 10 times, like, and I had sticky notes all over my door, like trying to like get myself geared up to map out what I was going to say. And then I was just emotionally distraught. Like, it just sounds bad. I don't know what I'm doing. And it was that constant sense of, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. But then finally, like, my phone was about to die. It was at 5%. My screen went dark. You know how like the power saving mode comes on? My screen went dark, and I was like, I just have to do this. I just needed to talk like I'm talking to my friend and just do this. And so then I just started it and said what I needed to say, and then stopped it. And right after that, my battery died, and so I didn't have time to go through and critique myself over and over again. And yeah, basically just
it's a
went
good,
with it.
like, set it and forget it.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, has been one of the most difficult parts about having a podcast, is that you have to listen to yourself over and over again when editing and when writing subtitles, and just really having to look at what you're doing as valuable. And I think that really comes back to business again and again, is just reminding yourself what I do is valuable, and what I do is purposeful, and I'm working really hard at it, and I'm continuing and persevering. Yeah, so that has been my experience with the insecurity side of business.
I'm just dying because I'm like, caveat, like, maybe what you're doing isn't valuable because no one's willing to pay for it and you didn't do enough research. But what we're talking about is the learning experience of it is the valuable part. So
Yeah.
just remember that, because if you come back to me and you're like, well, I couldn't get these foot popsicles to sell, no one wants to lick a foot. I'm sorry. Right. So anyways, all right, thanks. Oh, you know what? Support for our podcast comes from our intern, Darby. She didn't tell me to say that part. She's been researching podcasts and told us that we need to have a strong call to action at the end of our podcast. So here it is. Please tell your friends about our podcast and what you enjoy about it. Join us again next week, where we talk about part 2 of failure, how it's different for entrepreneurs.